Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank the organizers of this meeting for this invitation, simply because it brings me back to the good old days of JNU, what we think of as the good old days. You may not, of course, agree with me. Let me begin by saying that there is nothing so difficult, I think, in the life of a scholar as writing a textbook for school children. It's a very tough assignment, and I must confess that if I had known how tough it is, I would never have taken it on. But anyway, in my case, it was tough enough writing the book, and it got even tougher because of the kinds of criticism that was sometimes made of the book, which was so appallingly bad that I couldn't even be bothered to answer it. But anyway, that's another matter altogether. I had never written textbooks when I got an invitation, which I could not refuse because it came from Professor R.C. Majumdar in 1963, when I had just joined Delhi University, asking me if I would participate in this new program which the NCERT was starting of writing textbooks for schools. And would I write the textbook for class 6 and class 7? That's 12 and 13-year-olds. My first reaction was no, I've never written a textbook in my life, and I really am not terribly interested. And then I talked to various colleagues at Delhi University, and they said, you know, we're always complaining about how badly history is taught in school, with the result that the students that come up to do history at university are ill-prepared. Now, this is a chance for you to put down in the form of a book the kinds of things that you should be addressing in a textbook. So rather reluctantly, I took it on. And as I began to do my thinking about it and researching the idea of the textbook, I began to realize that there is a historiography involved in the writing of particularly textbooks. That is, that you have to go into the question of how did this idea arise and how was it referred to and handled by earlier historians, and what is the difference that we are making in writing new books. So this was a kind of background with which I began to think about the subject. My hesitation remained because I realized two things. One is that if you're writing for young teenagers, interested young teenagers, you have to be on top of the subject. There can be no dilly-dallying and saying, I may think this and I may think that and we might think. You have to be firm. You have to know what you're talking about. And believe me, not all of us always know what we're talking about. But anyway, there it is. The second thing is that you cannot talk down to your audience. The one thing that children and teenagers in particular are very aware of is, am I being treated as a child? Am I being talked down to? Or am I being treated as a thinking adult? So you have the problem that you're addressing people as thinking adults, knowing that they're not adult and that their thinking is to some extent limited. So it's a tough proposition. And I'm just amazed at the way people rush to sign contracts with publishers to write textbooks without really going into the question of what is implied by a textbook. But anyway, I took it on because I had done a little project for UNESCO on the textbooks that are used in the Delhi schools, and I was appalled at how bad they were. So I thought, at least if I write a book, it may not be that bad. It may not be ideal, but it won't be as bad as the ones that these poor things I have to learn from. And the second reason why I took it on is the reason that all historians take on public issues, public declarations, is that history is a changing subject. History is not a static discipline. It keeps on changing, and it keeps on changing as society changes, because it is very closely integrated to the kind of society that it comes from. So, what were the changes by the 1960s that we were beginning to be conscious of as historians? There were two changes in particular. One was the realization that there is such a thing as a historical method of looking at history, reading history, interpreting history. History was not a static discipline. The second big change was that at this time, in the post-independence period, there was the rise of social sciences all over the world. This was a new dimension to the study of society. And in India, we also had a reflection of the social sciences. That is, history came to be associated with sociology, economics, anthropology, archaeology, demography, you mention it, all the subjects that are involved in the study of a society. And it was these two approaches, the understanding of what is meant by a historical method and the understanding of how history was no longer a subject in indology, providing information, but was now a subject in the social sciences, demanding the analysis of society. And with these two considerations, I launched into writing my books. Now, I couldn't talk about this in a straightforward way. One has to give examples, one has to explain to the young student what these changes are. So I had to do a little exercise in what we call historiography, the study of why history is being written, who is writing it, what are they writing it, how does one explain what they are writing. This is one of the most exciting aspects of the study of history, and I'm sorry that we in this country don't give it more emphasis, which we should be doing, which we did in the CHS, but it's rare to find historiography properly taught in other places. So what was the tradition? The question that's always asked, what did the pre-modern Indians have as history? Okay, they had things like myths, the mythology of the Purans, they had the epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and the basic questions that kept coming up amongst historians was, to what degree are these histories in the sense in which we understand history? Or are they, very interestingly, representations of the past? And the present-day historian then studies them as the representations of the past, which makes them extremely interesting, but doesn't necessarily imply that you have to have the skeleton of chronology, you have to have an understanding of events and what happened. That came much later. So what do we have in our tradition? Apart from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, We do have a lot of narratives, regional narratives, which unfortunately we have not given too much importance to. We focus so much on the important Sanskritic tradition and the later Indian language tradition that we sometimes forget that, even the oral tradition and the study of localization of the main themes is extremely important, and particularly important to the study of history. So, coming on afterwards, we had the Charitas, which were the biographies of kings. We had the Vamshavalis, which were the chronologies of dynasties. And in the later period, we had the Tarikh, which was the biography of the ruler again. So this kind of tend towards writing about more realistically, writing about rulers and events was there in our tradition. The study of these texts was made right up to the 18th century, and then you had the intervention, the massive intervention of colonial thinking. And colonial thinking then brings in a new kind of historiography. Colonial writers went around asking learned scholars in India, what are the texts that are historical? And they quoted the Greek examples and the Chinese examples. And of course the reply was, we don't have texts like that. So the assumption of the colonial writing was, we have to start discovering and writing the history of India from scratch. There's nothing we can take from the Indian tradition. So the earliest colonial history is more invention than actual history. What am I referring to? I'm referring to the basic texts that the colonial writers started with. James Mill, The History of British India. And what was Mill's argument? Mill's argument was that the history of India consists of the history of two nations, the Hindu nation and the Muslim nation. Now remember, at that time, nationalism was alive all over, but this was not a definition of nationalism or nations. Nations are not defined by their religions, they're defined by other features. But anyway, he was insistent that there were these two nations, and his second thesis was that these two nations were constantly aggressive and hostile towards each other. They knew no peace with each other. And consequently, this theory of what came to be called the two-nation theory is enunciated by Mill, is picked up by some historians, becomes a part of the Indian historical tradition for many years until it is challenged and questioned by historians in the early 20th century, and particularly questioned around the 1950s and 60s after 1947. So this was one aspect of colonial thinking, and maybe one of the reasons why it was given a certain amount of authority was because the other interesting aspect of colonial intervention was working on the sources of Indian history, on which very fine work was done. For example, the philological studies of Sanskrit texts, which were being done for the first time, in a way. That was a new feature. And secondly, the study of the sources like deciphering inscriptions. The Brahmi script, which was deciphered in 1837, suddenly opens up a whole new world of source material for the historian, which is the world of the inscriptions. And many of us have argued that the major contribution to Indian history should be a detailed study of history from inscriptions rather than only from texts. Texts are very important, but the inscriptions are equally important for a historical understanding. And this is something which, of course, was done very, very carefully. The decipherment of Brahmi was extremely important. But anyway, returning to historiography, the common understanding was that all Asian societies have a system of what is called Oriental despotism. There is no state. There is only the despotic ruler. There is a peasantry, and there is a bureaucracy that controls the peasantry, collects the taxes, looks after the irrigation system, which is very important. And the wealth is all directed to the despot. Hence this fabulous story of the wealthy Asian rulers, which really was more mystic rather than actual, but nevertheless it was there. All of this, of course, meant, when they said that there's no state and there's no writing and so on, it meant, again, history was denied. The presence of history in the pre-modern Indian past was denied. Now, in addition to James Mill and the two-nation theory, there was Max Muller and a whole range of people from William Jones onwards who were analyzing the texts, the Sanskrit texts, and particularly the Vedic texts, and arguing for what they called the Aryan theory of race, that the Aryans were a superior race, superior to every other in India. The Aryans, the Hindus are in fact descendants of the Aryans. Hinduism is rooted in Aryan religion. So Aryanism became the important feature of this theory and this understanding of pre-modern early Indian history. Now these two theories, the two-nation theory and the theory of the Aryan race, became absolutely foundational to the history that was constructed by colonial writers. And as I said, some of these ideas seeped into Indian historical writing, some were questioned. And slowly and gradually, the questioning got bigger and bigger until, in fact, by the 1950s, both theories were seriously discarded or beginning to be discarded by professional historians. Now, it's important to remember to keep these two theories in mind, because they are constantly brought up again and again in history that we now regard as completely out of date. It has no standing in professional historical writing, but it is there in the public image of the ancient history. What is also important, the question of course is that how did all this come to be challenged? It came to be challenged because there were new ideas, new disciplines coming up. Archaeology was very important. Remember that in the 1920s, when we're still talking about the superiority of the Aryan race and the Aryan race being the root of Indian civilization, the Indus Valley civilization was discovered. And this was totally different from what was being said in the texts, what was found on the ground. Archaeology advanced, more and more excavations. So every statement one made about pre-modern history, you had to be sure that there was both textual evidence and archaeological evidence. And the two kinds of evidence always had to go together. This was a new entry into the field of history. And it is still a very important entry, which is why today you're having political battles over archaeological excavations. And I don't have to emphasize which battles were. And the other aspect, as I mentioned, was social sciences. Now, in the social sciences, you don't just say history tells us that this happened and this happened and this happened. The social sciences start asking questions about why did this happen, how did this happen, and what was the eventual result of what's happened. So it's a new set of questions. And what I'm arguing is that the questioning of existing history has always to come only by new methods of analysis and new kinds of questions that are to be asked of the sources. You cannot just sit there quietly saying, this is the way it is, but we believe in this and we believe in that and so on the other. You have to have this. And the more new evidence that comes in, the more complicated history becomes. I mean, you take something like the Aryan question today. In the time of Mueller, right up to the time of Mueller, it was, you read the texts, you read them carefully, you were very good Sanskritists, and that was all that was required. Then came archaeology. How do you correlate the texts with the text with the artifact? Very important. After that came linguistics, which is a study not just of language per se, but the function of language, the origin of language, the kinds of influences. And suddenly you get people writing about non-Aryan influences in Vedic Sanskrit. And linguistics takes on a life of its own, because remember that in any language, the moment you have a straightforward language that has an element of another language, you have to ask the question, what was the cultural relationship between the speakers of both languages? So, if you argue and if you agree that there are elements of non-Aryan in Vedic Sanskrit, you have to give some evidence for other speakers speaking other languages that might have had an influence. Now, all of this is really extending the research. And what I'm trying to argue is that as theories change, if the theory is valid and is not just a lot of nonsense, there is an extension of the research, of the ideas. And the good historian keeps up with this extension. At some point, in old age, one says, enough, I can't do anything more, and you leave it to the younger lot. As I keep on saying, it's now up to you guys to do the things. We're all through. But there is that notion, that importance of change and the extension of research. And so, what is it that one looks for when one talks about why and how? Why did an event take place? Did society change? Did caste change? We've all been brought up on the theory that caste, once it was defined as varnashram dharma, nothing changed. I'm sorry, that's not the case. We have a lot of very puzzling evidence which suggests that there were changes. There were new castes coming in, old castes being transferred into new castes, and so on and so forth. How does caste get transferred from one religious group to another? Muslims have castes. Christians have castes. What is this social organization? How did it change? And the social historian today is looking at the changes that occurred through time. Similarly, economy. We didn't have the same economy for 4,000 years, for goodness sake. We had different kinds of economies that interacted. You had pastoral groups, nomadic groups, you had primitive agriculture, you had advanced agriculture, you had urbanization and trade. What are these economic groups doing with each other and how are they relating? And then, very important, religion comes in. Religion is at one level what people believe in and worship, and a whole group forms around the people who believe in the same thing, worship the same thing. But let's not forget, as historians, religion plays a social role as well. Religion is fundamental to many social institutions to this day. You have schools, Shishu mandirs, madrasas, convents. There's religion in it. You have other kinds of institutions which also are religiously inspired. You have religious institutions playing a social role. The temple today is playing a major social role. The mosque, the masjid also played a social role in a certain kind of society. Churches the world over have played a social role. So it's not as if one is being anti-religion when one says, let's look at the social role. One is simply saying that there is a level at which you have worship and belief. There's another level at which those ideas get converted into social institutions. And as historians, we may be interested in the individual beliefs and things, but our interest shouldn't stop there. We should see religion in the social institutions as well. And that is one of the big changes that has come about in this. Now, coming back to the textbook, I'm sorry, am I going on for too long? The textbook is not just providing information. We all think of the textbook as, oh yes, I'll find out when this happened and that happened and the other happened and so on. The textbook is there to encourage the young child to think about what that child is reading. Why are we reading about the past? The past is over and done with. Do we have a connection with the past? And this is where history comes in. There are some connections with the past. There's also this famous thing about, we've always done it like this is traditional. What is meant by traditional? You're going back to the past. Are you really going back to the past? Or are you imagining that past that you're going back to? You have to teach the child to know not only the subject in terms of information, but how one asks questions of the subject, how one asks questions of what one is reading. I used to always, I tried when I was writing these textbooks, I took a few classes in schools because I wanted to see how the text would relate to school children. And we would always start off with this question. Someone would raise their hand and say, what do we mean by history? And I would sit there and say, well, you know, I can't summarize it. I've spent a lifetime doing it. And then I would say, you're sitting on a chair. The chair has a history. The act of sitting on a chair has a history. And they would all look at me and say, what? This chair has a history? And I would say yes, because your remote ancestors sat on the floor, on the ground. Then they invented the very low seat, what we in the old days used to call the piri, which was quite low, that much off the ground. And then gradually it got higher and higher and higher until you began to have chairs. And when you got high enough and had chairs, you had a back to the seat, you had arms to rest on, and it became a comfortable way of sitting down. Now, this didn't happen right at the beginning, it happened over time. And the historian of the chair will look into the issues of what went into changing it. And then, of course, the symbolism of the chair. Why is it that the throne is always a chair, or is a sort of gaddi with arms and backrest and so on? So that symbolism comes in. And then I would always end up by saying, and then there's the function of the chair. You go to the dentist, you sit in a dentist chair. And the fundamental, absolutely extreme function of the chair, of course, was the electric chair in America, which was used for the final punishment. Now, what I'm trying to say is really that everything that we use that surrounds us and so on has a history. And we can't just bypass it and say no. We have to be aware of this. This is you're teaching the child. Every object you see, every action you do, ask yourself, is this something new? What is its function? How did it come about? The curiosity about things. And then historiography. Why do we write history the way? What do we mean by historiography, which is looking at the historians, looking at what they write, so on. Who writes history? In the old days, it used to be, it's an easy subject. I remember when I was having this crisis about should I write a textbook or not, people came up to me and said, what's the problem with writing a textbook? You've written so many general histories of India, just pick out a few points and put them together, and you have a textbook. And I said, no, because a textbook has a different function. It's to teach children to think. And so, training becomes very important. You are also training the child in the subject in which you have a textbook. And so you have graded textbooks that go from the very simple to the more complicated because that training is absolutely necessary. What is the difference between looking at a text of anything, the Harsha Charita, there's a text before you, you look at it, but then you go and dig up near Kannauj and you find objects of various kinds. How do you correlate the two? What do the objects mean? What is the nature of evidence? The nature of evidence keeps on changing. And today, our evidence for many things in terms of identity, which is the big issue that everyone's battling over, the DNA, unheard of 50 years ago. Today, you keep on asking for excavated material, skeleton material, in order to get a DNA. So the point that I'm trying to make is that in all this business of teaching the child to think and so on, the narratives that are very important, when did this event happen? And this is a chronology which is much debated over because not everybody uses the same yardstick. So you have to be careful to say that according to this particular text, the Mahabharata dates to 980,000 BC. But according to this text, it dates to 100 BC. You have a difference. Now you can't just go on insisting that it dates to the Treta Yuga and not to the Kali Yuga without finding evidence in the Treta Yuga or from sources that refer to the Treta Yuga, which refer to the Rama story or whatever the story may be. The point I'm trying to make is that chronology may be a little uneven in parts, but there are many ways now of ascertaining a very precise chronology. And the historian should be aware of the fact that there are precise chronologies, that you don't have to go only by what mythology tells you or what is written in some text which may not be of much use. And then, of course, the comparative way of looking at societies. This is very, very crucial today because, in the late 19th century, when all these new things were happening and the social sciences came into existence and so on, the late 19th century, there were many theories of explanation. There were many philosophers and sociologists who said, I will tell you how these social institutions came into existence. I will tell you how history happened. You had Karl Marx with his long modes of production and his theory of slavery and feudalism and going on to capitalism. You had Max Weber very popular among sociologists today, going back into history, sociologists going back into history, talking about particularly religion and society. Now, I'm not saying that we as historians should pick up what Max Weber says about religion and society and say, this is what happened to Hinduism in the pre-second millennium AD, and this is what happened when Islam came in and so on. No. But there are questions that Max Weber and Weberites are asking about this relationship between religion and society, which questions we could ask of our material. We may find totally different answers, and good if they're different, but those questions are basic. And whether it comes from Marx, or whether it comes from Weber, or whether it comes from Foucault, or whether it comes from Hayden White, or any of these people that are mentioned these days, the questions are fundamental, and those questions are tied into history becoming a social science and have to be reflected in the textbooks that we are giving to students, school students. And please remember that these theories of explanation relate to understanding a historical period, a historical construction. They are not political theories. A Marxist understanding of history is an understanding of the historical society in Marxist terms. It is not communist history. Communism is part of a political theory, a political activity. I mean, I was quite appalled the other day when I heard an archaeologist talking about the bringing down of the Barbary Masjid and saying it was all because of communist historians. Marxist historians, yes, not communist historians, please. So do remember that there's a difference between using a theory to explain a society and using a theory for political reasons. That's only part of the society, but the two are very distinct and separate. The other point I want to make is, and then I'll stop, is that if you pick up a theory of explanation, be it Weberian or Marxist or any of the others I've mentioned, you don't have to take the entire theory and apply it and say, there, now this is a Marxist interpretation of history. I've proved that there was slavery, feudalism, capitalism. For example, the debate on feudalism in India began with one or two historians saying there was feudalism, and some went into the Marxist picture of feudalism and said that's exactly what it was. And then came other historians who said there was no feudalism. There were all these different things happening in society and economy, there were changes, but this was not what should be called feudalism. Find another name for it. So remember that you can pick up these questions. I don't mean arbitrarily, but there are some questions which are large enough to be taken out of the theory of explanation and applied, and you might get an answer at the end of it. So the point I'm trying to make is that the entire theory does not have to be applied. And you look really for what further explanation a theory can give. You must begin by saying, I will try it out. It's like going into a shop and saying, I'm trying out this sari. So you don't immediately say, I want it or I don't want it. You wrap it around yourself, and you look at yourself in the mirror and so on. Say, well, maybe, yes, it's all right. Maybe I can get another one with a little bit of this. There's a bit of that. I'm sorry I'm reducing it to something very banal. But there's a little bit of that in looking for historical explanations, because you have to keep trying. One works, one doesn't work, one aspect works, another aspect doesn't work. And that's the excitement, the intellectual excitement of writing history, that you're trying out these explanations and you're seeing which ones work and which ones don't work, why they don't work, why they work, and so on. There's a lot of why and how involved in the writing of history. And it's that sense of why and how which we need to get into our textbooks. Please, let me end by saying textbooks are not catalogues of information. They're not like telephone directories. There's a number on one side and there's a label on the other side, and you keep going down through time. In the year so-and-so this happened, in the year so-and-so this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. No, that's not history, that's not textbook. The textbook is a text that says to the child, now this is what happened, and let's look at why it happened and how it happened. Very, very fundamental. Thank you very much.